To recap for any new listeners and also for my regulars, so far we have gone over the early empires that gave way to the more renowned, such as the Roman Empire. We've also discussed the merging of cultures and the wars that ended empires while building others. We have discussed the fall of Western Rome and the emergence of the Visigoths, who are now living through the Visigothic kingdom. We have discussed the age of Islam and the birth of the caliphates that would take over the kingdom of Toledo, another name for Hispania, and also give birth to Al-Andalus. In this video, we will discuss the Reconquista, or in other words, the Visigoths, aka Christian territories of the former Visigothic kingdom, and their recapturing of their lands from the Islamic caliphates. It was these Christian campaigns against Al-Andalus that started shortly after the War of 711 and lasted over 700 years, officially ending in 1492, which began the western expansion of the Iberian region and their reconnaissance voyages and later invasions of the Americas. When the empire of Al-Andalus is mentioned, keep in mind that this was an empire that included the Spanish cities of Cordoba, Sevilla, and Granada. Those three would make up an area known as Andalusia. You also had Murcia, Extremadura, in which all of your major conquistadors that ravaged Meso and South America hailed from. You had Castile, Madrid, Valencia, Catalonia, portions of Aragon, Navarre, La Rioja, Leon, Asturias, the Basque Country region, and Cantabria. Now, the last three were not as integrated in Islamic culture as the other regions. In Portugal, it virtually included all of it, especially areas like Lisbon, Algarve, and Obidos. For a brief period, a portion of France known as Septimania, which was a part of Western Rome that was ceded to the Visigoths, was also a part of Al-Andalus. Now, this would be the modern region of Languedoc-Roussillon, and I am 85% sure that that was pronounced wrong. Now, before we get knee-deep in this video, you may be wondering, how did we get here? What are the connections between the Reconquista, the Roman Empire, the Greco-Roman world, or the Akkadian Empire? Well, the Visigoths of Hispania, who would become Spaniards, were not just Romans culturally, as they were heavily Romanized, but they were genetically as well, as they intermarried heavily and soon became a blended people. Iberia would have been under Roman rule from about 218 BC till about the 5th century CE. Now, those Romans were of Mediterranean descent and Mediterranean by culture. We may not think of the term Mediterranean when we think of Rome or its empire, as they were a powerhouse, but they were. They would also mix with the Iberians, who themselves would be a blend of their indigenous identity mixed with Phoenicians and Greeks. Those that live near the coastal areas of Iberia, especially the cities of Cadiz, Malaga, Adra, Almuñécar, and Gibraltar, all had Phoenician influence as those areas had Phoenician settlements and trading posts. Now, this would be the gateway for the Phoenician influence to permeate through the Iberian region. Going even further back, the Akkadians would leave their mark through laws, writings, and trade, but also their trace DNA through the Jewish populations who were the descendants of the Israelites, who were captured and lived among the Assyrians and Babylonians for generations before relocating to Iberia and becoming known as the Sephardic Jews. Now that we have this out the way, let's begin the show. Isabella of Portugal, the mother of the future Queen of Castile who bared the same name, came from a long line of ancestors with successful feats. What her daughter would accomplish would be no different. If the Moors thought that their former enemies would fully submit, they would have been foolish. Isabella of Portugal's forefathers have planted the seeds of the Reconquista well before her plan to take over Granada was ever conceived. The northwest region of the Iberian Peninsula and the Basque Country instantly started to resist their Islamic neighbors. Defeating the Moors in the Battle of Covendonga, Alfonso the Conqueror, the first true king of Portugal, overthrew the Moors in the taking of Obidos in 1148. One cannot mention that great feat without mentioning his chief rabbi, Yahya the Negro. Now, he was said to be a descendant of the Hebrews from ancient Babylon, as well as a descendant of King David himself. He was also put over all of the Jewish communities in Portugal. He valiantly fought alongside Alfonso and helped with the defeat of the Moors, which consolidated the Kingdom of Portugal. Yahya the Negro came from a long line of exilarchs, or rulers from the bloodline of King David post-Babylonian exile. This lineage would have religious and political control over the Jewish diaspora, whether it was Persian rule, Babylonian rule, or Islamic rule. He would be the great-grandson of Hiya al-Dawdi, a revered Jewish scholar and leader who was from Mesopotamia. His grandfather, Yahya ben Yahi, served as advisor to Alfonso's court. Now, prior to the 11th century, this family would be loyal to the Umayyad Caliphate, in which they served and brought great things to Islamic Spain. Yahya the Negro ancestor, Yahya ben Yahi al-Laythi, was not only an influential scholar, but he brought about the most dominant legal system in Islamic Spain. At the time when he opened the Maliki School of Islamic Law, he would also be giving the legitimacy to his family lineage, and they would become known as the Zimi elite under Muslim rule, which mean that they were a protected minority class who was allowed to keep their culture without interference, for a small fee, of course. All of his lineage were tax collectors who exacted tax from the Jewish people on behalf of their kings. Now, in this instance, that would be Portugal. His family hailed from Aldea dos Negros, or Village of the Blacks, now known as Obidos. Modern scholars would state that the term Negroes had nothing to do with their skin color being black, but maybe they had dark hair, which doesn't really make sense when you think of being in the Iberian region. It's pretty much normal to have dark hair, so that would not be something to point out one specific group about. However, the term that is used by African Americans, or a term that is used to identify African Americans, the term Negro, it means dark skin. Now, that term came from Old Portuguese and Spanish, the same word Negro, but more on that later. The Ibn Yaha family, who would spread throughout Portugal, Spain, Italy, and the Ottoman Empire, would come from Yahya's direct bloodline. However, by the 1400s, his descendants would become despised, and by the 1400s, many of Portugal Jews would be sold as slaves in Sao Tome and Principe, which is an island off the coast of Africa. The Jews of Portugal that were fortunate enough to not be sold into slavery or killed were exiled, while being forced to leave their children as they were to remain in Portugal. Now, this is something that you will see in later videos, especially in the New England region of the Americas. However, many of those children that were left ended up being considered the first quote-unquote African slaves in the Americas. Shortly after the fall of the Roman Empire, the Visigoths and European Christians would persecute the Jews until the Moors came and brought the Jews into their golden era. The descendants of the Portuguese Jews who were sold into slavery off the coast of Africa would be taken to what would become Brazil just one generation later and being forced to work on the sugar plantations. The reason behind such treatment from Portugal was none other than King Manuel I of Portugal marrying the daughter of King Ferdinand II and Queen Isabella, who was also named Isabella, Princess of Asturias. In order to be allowed to marry into the royal Spanish bloodline, Manuel was forced to follow the Spanish stance on Jews. Over time, the Moorish strongholds began to fall throughout their former empire, and many of the Jewish strongholds were destroyed as well, leaving only Granada by the year 1238. Now, let's go back to the year 1031, after the Christian forces started reclaiming their lands, starting with Cordoba. Muslim rulers were forced to pay tribute to Christian kingdoms of the north. Around the year 1200, Alfonso, the king of Leon, and Berengaria, the daughter of Alfonso, king of Castile, gave birth to a son. With their marriage beginning to fail, Alfonso kept his son Fernando inside of his court with the intent of stopping him from inheriting the throne of Castile. With the death of Berengaria's father, she, along with her younger brother, took control of the throne. Now, in a twist of fate, her brother would perish in a freak accident, leaving her the sole ruler of the throne. Concealing the death of the acting king of her kingdom, Berengaria sent for her son to spend time with her. And once there, she had him knighted and made King Fernando III of Castile, made him king. Now, nearly 2 decades later, both Fernando and his father had their eyes set on Al-Andalus, which was currently going through civil unrest following the struggle for power. Around 1230, after Alfonso died, shortly after Fernando III secured the throne of Leon, reuniting the two kingdoms of Castile and Leon, which would have made him the most powerful ruler of the Iberian Peninsula. By 1248, the Muslims were driven from central Iberia. With the fall of Cordoba, Valencia, and Seville, Granada became the last stronghold of Moorish Spain. Ibn al-Hamar agreed to become the vassal of Ferdinand III, making Granada a tributary state to the Kingdom of Castile. Now, over 2 centuries later, and that very legacy of Moorish conquest would still run through Isabella veins. It isn't hard to understand why she wanted to crush the Moors and take Granada as well, since she would be going down in history to be the one who reunited the Visigothic kingdom of Hispania and successfully got rid of the Jews and Muslims, making the region ruled by Christians again. Being third in line to the throne after her older half-brother Henry of Castile and younger brother Alfonso, Isabella knew that she would have a struggle for the throne. After the death of her father, she was left to be cared for by her brother. Under duress, Henry made his younger half-brother heir under the conditions that he married his daughter Joanna. Their union was short-lived as Alfonso died in 1468. The nobles who supported his reign suspected foul play, but to Isabella's benefit, she then was promoted to next in line to take the throne. Going against the wishes of her brother, she did not marry Alfonso, but instead wedded her second cousin Ferdinand. With Isabella's union to Ferdinand, they unified the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, which would later become known as Spain. With her promotion came conflict, as her older brother's daughter, which is essentially her niece, contested her for the throne after his death, known as the War of Castilian Succession. Spain and Portugal fought for the succession of the Crown of Castile, with Isabel winning on land and Joanna winning at sea. The conflict ended with the Treaty of Alcacovas. That treaty made Isabella Queen of Castile and gave Portugal sole access of the Atlantic Ocean. Now, this will be important when we talk more about the Age of Exploration. Portugal also won the sphere of influence, maintaining control over all territories that was disputed among the two, with the exception of the Canary Islands. The treaty also gave Portugal control over Guinea and their gold mines, Cape Verde, and the exclusive right to conquer the Kingdom of Fez. Most importantly, this treaty gave the monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, the ability to put all their focus and resources into defeating the Moors once and for all. Portugal was a powerhouse in their own right and have been given credit for changing the modern world. João, or John I of Portugal, of the Aviz dynasty, would be known as preserving Portugal's independence. Being known to the Spanish as Bastard John, he is the son of King Peter I of Portugal and a common woman from the Kingdom of Galicia. He was known as Victoria's ruler to Portugal becoming Grand Master of the Order of Aviz. The military order of Saint Benedict of Aviz is a Portuguese order of chivalry or knighthood, founded in the mid 1100s, having close ties with the military order of Christ. The former Knights Templars of Portugal region joined this society after the Knight Templars were disbanded. Now, they would also come to Portugal to assist the Christians with the Reconquista and the continuation of the Crusades. In return, they were protected by King Denis of Portugal when the Templars were abolished by the Pope Papal Bull of 1312. And not only that, but he refused to pursue and persecute them as other sovereign states under the Catholic Church influence did. Another great legacy that came from Portugal came through King John's son, Dom Henrique, better known as Prince Henry the Navigator, and the mind that was credited behind the caravel sailing ship. This ship made its debut in the mid 1400s, and more than likely, Prince Henry was not the mastermind behind this invention. In the early 1400s, between the years of 1416 and 1420, the prince founded a school for navigation known as the School of Sagres, or however you pronounce that, but it's spelled Sagres. Now, this school was for anyone interested in the field of navigation and exploration. This is where they would have come to learn the latest advancements in sailing, share and trade information among nations when it came to map making, sharing any knowledge that was new of cartography. This was also where Portuguese pilots, who were the real reason behind every early European explorations, this is where they would be trained. In later videos, you will see how the great names such as Columbus actually relied on these Portuguese pilots to guide them through the unknowns reaching the Americas. The location was a strategic one as most of Portugal's exploration missions took off from nearby Lagos. This Portugal city is actually where Lagos, Nigeria gets its name, which was a major hub for maritime activities such as shipmaking. Due to his fascination with the legend of Prester John, he kicked off what would be known as the Age of Discovery, which also began the process of European colonization and the transatlantic slave trade. It is also believed that Henry the Navigator wanted to see how deep in the continent of Africa the Moorish influence actually went. It is important to note that in ancient times, there were no Africa, or there was no Africa as a continent. This was, however, a misnomer because there was a tribe known as the Afri people. However, this referred to the people south of the Mediterranean area, which would technically be ancient Libya. And the Romans would refer to their province of Tunisia as Africa Proconsularis. Even though he claimed to search for the Moors, he eventually started enslaving people from the sub-Saharan region who had no ties to the Moorish Empire. Portugal would make business agreements with the region of what is now Mauritania around the year 1440 and gained access to their ports and bypassed the Berber middlemen when it came to trade. Now, it's important to mention that these same people that Portugal did early business dealings with, they also ended up enslaving them. Before the relations soured, however, the Mauritanians introduced the Portuguese to chiefs of Senegal, Ghana, Nigeria, and Congo. Now, when meeting these different tribes, this would of course result in better trade deals and alliances. After the fall of the Phoenician city-states, their vast wealth of knowledge was utilized by their successors, including but not limited to their trade routes, their knowledge of seafaring and shipbuilding, as well as information on people from antiquity. Now, whenever an area was conquered, their shipmaking and their navy was now in the hands of the empire who they were absorbed into. Thanks to Prince Henry's father and the capturing of the Moroccan port of Ceuta, Portugal was now in the perfect spot to launch several expeditions where they could use newly acquired knowledge while traveling, especially along the western coast of Africa where gold, spices, ivory, and humans made them richer. The taking of Soweto would be a bigger part of the Reconquista that was happening as the Christians were attacking the Moors and reclaiming areas and spreading their Christian influence over the region. The majority of Portugal's African slaves were sent to Lisbon, however. Now, a trend that you will see throughout the course of history is the destruction of files containing key information on how many slaves are brought and from where. Other common details that end up missing is information on the institutions who were involved, and due to the natural calamities that would happen, such as fires, for example, many records were lost. Now, records of the royal chronicler Zorera states that less than 1,000 African slaves were brought to Portugal between 1441 and 1448. After 1448, an estimated 1,000 slaves arrived annually until about 1490, where that number would then increase to around 2,000 per year. Portugal already had good relations with certain regions of Africa, but by this point, the majority of their slaves would be coming from Cape Verde, Sao Tome and Principe, Angola, and Mozambique. In 1483, they reached the Congo and made an alliance with the subject of King Nzinga e Nkugu, eventually returning to Portugal with diplomats. By 1491, they were baptized into Christianity and returned to Congo alongside Portuguese priests, masons, and soldiers. That same year, the King of Congo was also baptized, and along with his royal family, they took on Portuguese names. The king then became known as João I of Congo. Henry the Navigator's great nephew, King John II, led their first successful voyage via Bartholomew Diaz to the southern tip of Africa, while quote-unquote searching for a water route to India, which would have been known as Hindustan at the time. Diaz returned to King John's court to share the historic and glorious tales of his voyage, while an eager sailor, known today by the name of Christopher Columbus, was in that attendance. It was around this time that Columbus entertained King John with his own ambition to set sail, but to no avail, as the king basically didn't see the need to actually go through with this. Now, my guess is, why would he need to use Columbus when he basically already knew how to get to where he needed to get to? And Portugal already had maps vaguely marking out that route. But of course, according to history, they said he wasn't interested due to his lack of faith in Columbus' calculations. Remember, in prior videos, how I mentioned the Silk Road routes over land were severed in Western Rome. For starters, the people of Iberia weren't blocked from going overland. However, a luxury tax would have been given to them as they were now Muslim. Once the Ottoman Empire took over Egypt, the Levant, and Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul, they took full control over the trade between Asia and Europe. Now, back in Granada, the Sultan Abu Hassan Ali refused to pay tribute to the crown of Castile. To make matters worse, he also invaded the city of Zahara de la Sierra, killing and enslaving several unarmed Christians. Abu Hassan was no stranger to controversy, as he abandoned his first wife for his former Christian slave, Isabella de Solis, who became known as Soraya after her conversion to Islam. In doing so, he caused an uproar and rebellions, which Granada rebellions resulted in Abdul being replaced by his son Muhammad. Wanting to gain prestige and honor, Muhammad attempted to invade Castile, but he instead ended up as a prisoner at Lucena. With Muhammad being held captive, his father regained his former position. Isabella was no stranger to conflict and would be considered a warrior queen. She was known to not only travel with her military campaigns, but also was in charge in strategic and tactics planning for her generals. In the year 1487, the Catholic monarchs prepared to conquer the city of Malaga from the Emirate of Granada. Using this opportunity to crush their Islamic presence once and for all, a deal was struck with Muhammad. He would be released from prison and have the Christians' full support to recover his throne if he agreed to hold Granada as a tributary kingdom under the Catholic monarchs and agreed not to intervene in the siege of Malaga. Malaga was a key defense for Granada as it was the second largest city in the Emirates and was home to the largest port. Only lasting 4 months, the siege was over and the majority of the population were either enslaved or put to death. There were some deals made, of course, to protect property and the right to keep their religion and lives, but at a steep cost of standing down while handing over control. As promised, Muhammad was able to take over all of Granada in 1487, along with the northeastern region area of the country consisting of Velez Rubio, Velez Blanco, Veraguerix, and Baza. However, shortly after he was given control, Christian forces started closing in on him, taking areas of his kingdom. Some believe that he took no action, believing that the land would be returned to him. However, others believe that he knew that if he reacted, he would be crushed since the Catholic monarchs bled Granada dry financially. Fearing the inevitable, Muhammad reached out to the Sultan of Egypt, Al-Ashraf Saif al-Din Qaitbay, for aid. Qaitbay's hands were tied as he shared a common enemy with Castile and Aragon, the Ottoman Turks, and he did not want to lose the alliance that they had. Being the last outpost of the Kingdom of Granada, Muhammad had to come to grips with the reality that the age of Moorish Muslim rule of Al-Andalus was coming to an end. During the Granada War, heavy artillery was used, including gunpowder, cannons, and firepower. The Muslims, ironically, would introduce this technology to Iberia, as it was employed in the Middle East as early as the 1200s. By the 1500s, Beretta, yes, the Beretta that you're probably thinking of, they were producing firearms in Italy as early as 1526. On January 2nd of 1492, Granada had surrendered. The royal procession met with the Moorish Sultan, where the key of Granada was given to Isabel and Ferdinand. Muhammad's mother, severely disappointed in her son for what she perceived as weakness, insisted that her son be spared from the act of kissing the hands of Isabella and Ferdinand. In the attendance of yet another world-changing event was Christopher Columbus, who would soon become an important character in the future of Spain. It was at Suspiro del Moro, modern name for a place where Muhammad took his final glance at the Alhambra, where his mother scolded him, saying the infamous words, "Weep like a woman, for what you cannot defend as a man." All throughout Spain today, these feats are celebrated every year during the Festival of Moros y Cristianos, or Festival of Moors and Christians, where different regions reenact their triumph over the Moors during the Reconquista. With the Christian takeover of Iberian Peninsula, Spain started major expulsions of both Jews and Muslims. The Alhambra Decree of 1493, or the Edict of Expulsion, was issued by the monarchs, and as a result, practicing Jews were expelled from Spain and all of their territories. The monarchs had a long-standing hate towards the Jews, and just a century before the edict, there were a major massacre of Jews in Spain. It is estimated that around 300,000 Jews in Spain, only 100,000 of them refused to convert and was expelled, leaving the conversos to remain in Spain until many made their way to the Americas, along with several Muslims who suffered the same fate. Prior to the Christians taking over, the Islamic Moors and the Jews coexisted, intermarried, and created the coveted golden age of Al-Andalus. Something that the monarchs wanted to make sure never happened again, of course. Once known as a protected people or people of the book, Jews were no longer tolerated unless they were high ranking or served in some capacity to the monarchs. Many Jews served as government officials and moneylenders, mainly to merchants, aristocrats, and the monarchs. In medieval Europe, Jews were the only reliable source of taxes and was also the only group that could loan at a profit. Jewish expulsions from Europe was nothing new, as there were similar expulsions to what Spain did in March of 1492. Babylon, or modern Iraq, would have done the same in 586 BC. Roman Judea, or modern Israel, Palestine, would have done the same in 70 CE. England in 1290, Hungary in 1349 and 1360. France in 1394. Austria would have done it in 1421, with Sicily following in 1492, Lithuania in 1495, Portugal in 1497, Nuremberg of about 1499. Then you had Naples in 1510, Milan in 1597, and more recently, Yemen in 2021. Just 7 short months after the fall of Granada, in 1492, there was a man named Columbus that sailed the ocean blue. And from that, the Americas, as the Taíno, the Arawak, the Maya, Aztecs, the Winya, the Timucua, the Cusabo, the Guale, those last four would be people that have descendants that are now known as the Gullah, but I will explain more on that later. You would also have the Apalachee, the Choctaw, the Inca, the Perupecha, and many others who, as they know it, the Americas would forever be changed. Now, we will stop here for now, but be sure to check out my next installation to the series, which we will discuss the invasions of the Americas from the Spanish and the bloody conflicts that have left out of mainstream history, but was the most influential to Europe as it built the grand Europe that we know of today. The amount of wealth that came from the Americas succeeded anything that any other place provided to medieval Europe. More wealth came from the Americas than it did from the Mediterranean trade, Africa with its gold, ivory, and slave trade, and anything that was going on. For instance, just from the ransom of the Inca Atahualpa in Cusco, Spain got around $2.23 billion from the Incan Empire of Tiantiansuyu. In Mexico, about $7 billion in today's currency came from gold alone. That's not including the wealth from silver mines, slaves, or the mass plundering of temples and palaces, or other resources. And on that note, join me next time on Untold Histories with Harry.